blood on her knuckles had dried to the color of rust, cracking along the lines of her fingers every time she flexed them, and the taste of copper sat on the back of her tongue like a penny she had been sucking for hours. Wren pressed her spine against the chain-link fence surrounding the training pit and tried to breathe through her mouth because the air in the compound smelled like wet dog and old leather, and the sour tang of male sweat and breathing through her nose made her stomach turn. Somewhere beyond the fence, in the great stone lodge where the Alpha King of the Northern Territories was being hosted tonight, torches burned in iron sconces. She could see the amber glow through the trees, flickering against the fog that rolled down from the mountains every evening at this hour. She did not know yet that in less than 20 minutes that light would find her. But right now the only thing finding her was Garrett's boot. It connected with her shin and she buckled, catching herself on the fence with fingers that screamed where the skin had split. The chain link bit cold into her palms, November coal. The kind that made the metal feel wet even when it was dry. "You missed the third rotation again," Garrett said, standing over her with his arms crossed. He was the beta's son, which meant he was untouchable, and he knew it the way certain dogs know when they are behind a fence and the thing they are barking at cannot reach them. He had a face like bread dough, pale and soft in places it should not have been soft for a 23-year-old wolf, and his eyes were the flat gray of river stones. When he smiled, which he was doing now, his canines showed. They were average canines. He kept them filed to look sharper. "That was not a miss," Wren said. She straightened, keeping her weight on her good leg. Her shin throbbed in a deep, bonewood way that told her it would bruise purple by morning. I adjusted the angle because Thomas left his guard open on the right. The rotation manual says to adapt to the opening. Garrett stepped closer. It smelled like cheap body spray, the kind that came in black cans with names like Surgeon or Peerdrater, and underneath it, the damp wool scent of a wolf who had not shifted in days. "The rotation manual," he repeated, his voice pitched high in mimicry. She adjusted the angle. His normal voice came back flat and heavy. "You are not in a position to adjust anything, Wren. You are in a position to do exactly what I tell you, exactly when I tell you. Because you are the lowest-ranking wolf in this compound, and the only reason you are allowed in the training pit at all is because my father thinks it is funny to watch you try." That was true, or close enough to true that arguing would cost more than it was worth. Wren had been the lowest-ranking member of the Ashfall Pack for 6 years, since the night her mother died in the southern border skirmish, and her father simply never came back from the grief. He had walked into the woods one January morning and kept walking, and the pack had found his clothes by the frozen creek 3 days later, but never found him, and after that Wren became the girl who belonged to no one. Packs did not treat such girls kindly. Kindness was a resource, and resources flowed upward. She had survived by being useful. She could stitch wounds faster than the pack's actual medic, a drunk named Howell whose hands shook before noon. She could identify 37 medicinal plants by smell alone, a trick her mother had taught her in the years before the border war. Sitting cross-legged in their kitchen while rain hit the tin roof and her mother held dried leaves under her nose. Yarrow, comfrey, mugwort. She could set a dislocated shoulder. She could cook for 40 wolves on a budget meant for 15. But none of that made her valuable enough to protect. It made her valuable enough to keep alive, and there was a difference. Now Garrett was circling her the way he always circled her before the real cruelty started, and the other wolves in the training pit had gone quiet the way they always went quiet. There were 11 of them tonight, ranging from 16 to 30, all of them ranked above her, all of them performing the same calculation they always performed. Is it worse to watch, or worse to be noticed watching? Wren did not blame them for choosing silence. She had done the same math herself, I think, Garrett said. stopping in front of her and tilting his head in a gesture that was supposed to look wolfish, but looked instead like a dog hearing a strange sound. "That you need a lesson in your place, a real lesson." He glanced over his shoulder at the group performing for them. "She wants to fight like a ranked wolf. Fine. Let her fight a ranked wolf." Ren's stomach dropped. Not the metaphorical stomach dropping that people described in stories, but the actual physical sensation, a lurching downward shift of her organs that made her vision tighten at the edges. She knew what he meant. She had seen him do this to others twice. Both times the wolf who accepted the challenge spent weeks recovering. "I challenge you," Garrett said, and he said it loudly enough for the words to carry across the pit and into the cold air beyond. He was invoking formal challenge protocol. Once spoken, it could not be withdrawn. A formal challenge in the training pit, witnessed by pack members under the old laws. He grinned, and there it was, the filed canines catching torchlight. "Do you accept?" She could not refuse. That was the elegant cruelty of it. Under pack law, refusing a formal challenge from a higher-ranked wolf meant automatic submission to whatever penalty the challenger named. Garrett had used this exact mechanism on a young wolf named Petra last spring, and the penalty had been 3 months of kitchen duty on half rations. Petra still flinched when Garrett walked past her in the hallways. "I accept," Ren said, because the only thing worse than fighting a wolf she could not beat was giving him the power to punish her without the fight. Garrett's grin widened. "Good." He cracked his neck, rolling his head from side to side with the slow theatrical pleasure of someone who had already won. "Training pit roles, half shift only. First to yield or go unconscious." He paused, letting the words settle like sediment in water. "And since we have guests tonight, why do we not make it interesting? Loser cleans the guest quarters on hands and knees." In front of the Alpha King's delegation, a murmur rippled through the watching wolves. The Alpha King's delegation. Ren had forgotten, or rather she had not forgotten, but had filed the information in the back of her mind where inconsequential things live, because the visit of the Alpha King of the Northern Territories had nothing to do with someone like her. He was here to negotiate a territorial treaty with Alpha Kessler, something about the mountain passes and winter hunting rights. Important wolves meeting about important things in the warm stone lodge while she bled in the training pit. That was about to change. Garrett stripped off his jacket and tossed it to one of his friends, a wolf named Dylan, who caught it with the eager reflexes of someone who wanted badly to be liked. Ren had nothing to strip off. She was wearing what she always wore to evening training, a long-sleeved thermal shirt that had been white 2 years ago and was now the gray of old dishwater, and canvas pants she had patched at both knees with fabric from a curtain she found in a donation bin behind the pack's community hall. Her boots were the one good thing she owned, leather and steel-toed, a gift from Hal the medic on a day when he was sober enough to notice she was training barefoot. She settled into her stance. Left foot forward, weight balanced, hands up with the palms open, because she did not have the mass to throw power punches, and she knew it. Her style was redirection, angles, using the opponent's momentum to create openings. She was fast, faster than anyone in Ashfall gave her credit for, and she was precise. But Garrett outweighed her by 80 pounds and had a wolf that was, by all accounts, brutishly strong even if it lacked finesse. "Begin," someone said. She did not see who. Garrett came at her the way large wolves always came at smaller opponents, straight ahead and heavy, trusting his mass to end it quickly. Ren sidestepped, pivoting on her lead foot, and his fist cut through the space where her head had been. She could feel the wind of it across her ear. She struck as he passed, a sharp palm heel to his floating ribs on the left side, and felt the satisfying thud of contact against muscle. He grunted, turned. His eyes had shifted, the flat gray bleeding into amber at the edges as his wolf pushed forward. Half shift meant partial transformation. Claws enhanced strength, denser bone. Not full wolf form. The rules existed because full shifts in an enclosed pit were how wolves died. Wren let her own shift come. It was thin, as it always was. Her wolf was small, undersized, a runce wolf that the pack had laughed about since her first shift at 13. Her claws extended, but they were short, barely an inch past her fingertips. Her vision sharpened, her hearing opened up, and suddenly she could hear everything: the breathing of the spectators, the creak of the chain link in the wind, and underneath it, very faintly, music from the stone lodge, where the Alpha King's feast was underway. Something with strings, a cello maybe. The sound was so incongruous with the moment that it almost made her laugh. Garrett came again. This time he was faster, adjusted, and his clawed hand caught her shoulder as she twisted away. The fabric of her thermal shirt parted like wet tissue paper, and then the skin beneath parted too. 3 lines of searing white heat from her collarbone to the top of her bicep. She hissed through her teeth. Blood welled immediately, hot against the cold air, and she could feel it sliding down her arm in a single thick line. First blood, Garrett announced to the audience, as if they could not see it themselves. Wren reset her stance. The cuts were shallow, she told herself, even as the burning deepened. She could still use the arm. She circled left, keeping distance, reading his footwork. He favored his right, always had. He loaded his weight onto his back foot before a lunge, a telegraph so obvious that she could time it by heartbeat. He lunged. She dropped under his arm, spinning low, and drove her palm upward into his chin. The impact snapped his head back. She followed with an elbow to his solar plexus and felt the air leave him in a bark of surprise. For 2 seconds, she thought she might actually win this. Then Garrett's hand closed round her wrist and the world tilted sideways. He wrenched her forward and down, off balance, and his knee came up into her stomach with a force that emptied her lungs entirely. She folded. Could not help it. The pain was a white sun behind her eyes, radiating outward, and her diaphragm spasmed and refused to draw air. He released her wrist and she dropped to the ground on all fours, gasping. He kicked her in the ribs, casual, the way someone kicks a piece of furniture that is in their way. Yield, he said. Wren braced her hands on the frozen dirt of the pit floor. She could feel the cold of it through her split knuckles, could feel each individual grain of grit pressing into her torn skin. Blood dripped from her shoulder onto the ground between her hands, and the drops were very dark against the pale earth, almost black in the torchlight. She did not yield. Something in her chest behind the pain, underneath the spasming muscle and the empty lungs, was burning. Not the burn of injury, a different burn, deeper, hotter. It sat in the hollow of her sternum like an ember that had been banked for years and was now, for reason she did not understand, catching air. Wren stood up. Garrett's expression flickered. Just for a moment, just a half-second tremor across his doughy features, but she saw it. He had expected her on the ground. He had expected the yield. What he got instead was Wren on her feet, with blood running down her arm and her eyes doing something that even she could not explain, because the wolves watching from the fence would later say that her eyes changed color. They would say that the flat brown went gold, true gold, not the amber of a normal shift, but the bright burning gold of something old. She did not know what was happening. She only knew that the ember in her chest was spreading, and her muscles felt like they had been plugged into a current, and her wolf, her small runt wolf, was making a sound in her mind that she had never heard it make before. Not a whimper, not the submissive whine it usually defaulted to in the presence of ranked wolves. A growl, low, steady, the kind of growl that did not need volume because it carried authority. Garrett lunged again. Wren moved. But she moved differently this time, faster. Her hand came up and caught his forearm mid-swing, stopping it dead in a way that should not have been physically possible given their size difference. He pulled, she held. The tendons in her wrist stood out like cables and her claws sank into his forearm, and he made a sound, a surprised yelp, undignified. The sound of a dog that has been nipped by something it assumed was prey. She threw him, not far. 4 feet. Maybe 5. But she threw him, and he landed on his back on the frozen ground with a thud that sent a puff of dust into the torchlight, and for a long, ringing moment, no one in the training pit breathed. Then the scent hit her. It came from nowhere and everywhere, carried on the fog that drifted through the chain-link fence, and it was nothing she had ever smelled before in her life. Pine resin. The kind that bled from cut bark in late autumn, thick and golden, wood smoke, but not the acrid smoke of a cooking fire, the deep sweet smoke of cedar burning slow. And underneath those something wilder, something that smelled like the air before a lightning strike, electric and humming and alive. Her wolf went silent, not calm, not submissive, reverent. "Mate," her wolf whispered. The word dropped into her mind like a stone into still water, and the ripples went everywhere. Ren turned toward the fence. He was standing at the edge of the training pit, just outside the chain link, and he had clearly been there for only seconds because the wolves near the fence were still scrambling to their feet in surprise, still processing the fact that the Alpha King of the Northern Territories was standing in their training compound instead of sitting in the stone lodge drinking their Alpha's expensive whiskey. He was enormous, that was the first thing. Not simply tall, but built at a scale that made the wolves around him look like adolescents, broad-shouldered and dense with the kind of muscle that came not from training, but from a body that had been engineered by bloodline for war. His hair was black and cut close at the sides, longer on top, and it was damp from the fog. His jaw was a hard line interrupted by a scar that ran from beneath his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a pale seam in skin the color of dark honey. He was wearing a black coat that hung open over a simple dark shirt. No insignia, no crown, no jewelry. Nothing that announced his rank except the way every wolf within 30 feet of him was trying not to look directly at his face. His eyes found hers. They were amber. Not the muddy amber of a normal wolf's shift, but clear, like tree sap held up to sunlight, with dark rings around the irises that made them look almost backlit. And when they locked onto Ren, kneeling in the dirt with blood on her arm and dust on her face and her patched canvas pants torn at the knee, those eyes did something that she would remember for the rest of her life. They widened, just a fraction, just enough to show that something behind them, something ancient and enormous and not entirely human, had woken up. His nostrils flared. He was scenting her. She could see his chest expand with the breath, could see his hands, which had been loose at his sides, curl into fists so tight that the leather of his gloves creaked. For 3 full seconds nobody moved. Then Garrett got up from the ground behind her, and his voice, still pitched for performance, still carrying the oblivious confidence of a man who had not yet realized the situation had fundamentally changed, said, "Get back on your knees. Omega, I did not say you could stand." The Alpha King moved. He did not run. He did not rush. He took 3 steps forward, and the chain-link fence, which was 7 feet tall and anchored in concrete, peeled apart under his hands like aluminum foil. The sound it made was a shrieking metallic groan that silenced every voice in the compound. He stepped through the gap he had made, his coat catching briefly on a jagged edge of torn metal. And he walked into the training pit with the unhurried precision of something that did not need to rush, because nothing in this pit, nothing in this compound, nothing in this territory could stop him. He walked past Rin, close enough that his coat brushed her injured arm. and where the fabric touched her skin, she felt heat, a pulse of warmth that sank through the cold and the pain and reached somewhere she did not have a name for. His scent wrapped around her like a physical thing, pine resin and cedar smoke and lightning, and her wolf made a sound that was not a growl and not a whimper, but something in between. Something that sounded like coming home, sounds if coming home had a voice. He stopped in front of Garrett. The beta's sun was still half shifted, his claws out, his gray eyes wide and getting wider as the reality of what was happening climbed his spine like ice water. The Alpha King stood a full head taller than him, maybe more, and the difference was not just height, but density. Presence, the sheer gravitational weight of a wolf whose power was so far beyond Garrett's that the comparison was not wolf to wolf, but wolf to weather. The Alpha King said nothing for a long moment. He simply looked at Garrett the way a man looks at a stain on a table, assessing what it will take to remove it. Then he spoke. His voice was low, unhurried, with a roughness at the edges that suggested his wolf was very close to the surface and was being held there by will alone. "You kicked her," he said, while she was on the ground. Garrett's mouth opened. He had the look of a man who had been speaking a language fluently his entire life and had suddenly forgotten every word. He started, and then stopped. "This is a formal challenge, Alpha. Pack law." She accepted the terms. The Alpha King tilted his head. The gesture was nothing like Garrett's imitation of it earlier. Where Garrett's had been performative, this was predatory, the slow tilt of an apex creature calculating angles. "I watched," he said. "I saw the challenge. I saw the terms." He paused. "I also saw you kick a wolf half your size in the ribs while she was on the ground, after she was already down." His voice did not rise. It dropped, and from what I can see, she is bleeding from cuts that go to the bone, and you do not have a scratch on you that she did not earn fairly. "Alpha King Kalen," Garrett said, and his voice had found the register it used when addressing his father. Careful and deferential, a voice designed to slide under anger without triggering it. "I meant no disrespect. This Omega is unranked. She has no protector, no family. The challenge was a training exercise. Nothing more." A ripple went through the watching wolves. Several of them had the decency to look at the ground. The Alpha King, Kylan, turned his head slightly, not looking away from Garrett, but angling his face toward Ren. She could see his profile, the scar, the hard line of his jaw, the way a muscle in his cheek tightened and released like a fist opening and closing. "What is your name?" he asked. Ren swallowed. The ember in her chest was still burning, pulsing with each beat of her heart, and his scent was so thick in the air around her that she could taste it on the back of her tongue, pine and cedar, and the sharp, bright note of ozone. "Ren," she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "Ren Calloway." Something moved behind his eyes at the name. A flicker. Recognition or something close to it, though she could not imagine why. He turned back to Garrett. "Ren Calloway has no protector," he repeated, and the repetition was deliberate, a blade being drawn. "No family, no rank." He stepped forward, and Garrett stepped back, an involuntary retreat that the Beta's son would later deny. "Then let me make this simple enough for you to understand, Beta's son. I am stepping into this challenge on her behalf. Same terms. Half shift, first to yield or go unconscious." He paused, unless he would like to withdraw. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ren had ever heard. Garrett's face went through a sequence of expressions like a slot machine landing on the wrong combination. Shock, calculation, fear. He looked over his shoulder at the watching wolves, searching for an out, and found nothing but averted eyes. He looked at Ren, and in that look there was something she had not expected, a flash of something almost like hurt, as if he could not understand why this was happening to him, as if the universe had broken a promise he had not known he was relying on. "Aye," he said. He licked his lips. His claws retracted. His shoulders dropped an inch, then another, and then he was sinking. Not to his knees, but into the posture that wolves took when the fight had left them before it began. Head angled to expose the throat, eyes down. "I yield," he said. The Alpha King did not move. He stood there for a long moment, looking down at the beta's son with an expression that was not triumph and not contempt, but something closer to disappointment. The flat, tired disappointment of a man who had hoped for a fight and received a surrender. Then he turned and looked at Ren. The full force of those amber eyes hit her like a wave, and her wolf did something that wolves were not supposed to do. It pushed forward without being called, surging up through her chest and into her throat, and she felt her eyes shift gold again, the bright impossible gold that she had never been able to summon before tonight. And her skin prickled with heat, and the ember behind her sternum became a flame. Callan's pupils dilated. His lips parted. She could see his canines, and they were not filed. They were real and long and white, and they pressed against his lower lip in a way that was not threatening but hungry. "Come here," he said. She should not have moved. Every instinct she had built over 6 years of surviving at the bottom of a pack hierarchy told her to stay still. Stay small, do not draw attention. Do not approach power, because power always costs you something. But her wolf was moving, and her legs were moving, and the scent was pulling her forward, the way a river pulls a leaf. And before she could stop herself, she was standing in front of him, close enough to see the individual threads of silver in his coat, close enough to feel the heat radiating off him like a furnace. He reached out. Slowly, his gloved hand rose, and his fingers touched the edge of the wound on her shoulder, the 3 claw marks that Garrett had opened, and his touch was so light that she barely felt the pressure. What she felt instead was a cascade of warmth that spread from the point of contact down her arm and across her chest and into her stomach and lower, a warmth that was not sexual and not platonic, but something between and beyond both, something that felt like recognition. "Who did this?" he said. Not a question, a demand wrapped in a quiet voice. She looked up at him. The height difference forced her to tilt her head back, exposing her throat in a way that was instinctive and involuntary, and made his eyes flash so bright that she could see her own reflection in them. "Garrett," she said during the challenge. His jaw tightened. The muscle beneath the scar flexed and held. He did not look at Garrett. He looked at her, only at her, and then he did something that made every wolf in the training pit inhale sharply. He shrugged off his coat. The black fabric pulled on the ground behind him, and he was left in his dark shirt, and then he was pulling the shirt over his head, and Ren had a brief, overwhelming impression of a torso that looked like it had been carved from dark wood and then scarred by decades of war, before he was wrapping the shirt around her shoulders, pulling it closed over her torn thermal, his hands deft and careful and warm even through the leather of his gloves. The shirt smelled like him. Pine and cedar and lightning. She could feel the heat trapped in the fabric sinking into her skin, into her wounds, into the cold places that had been cold for so long she had stopped noticing. "You are coming with me," he said, and before she could respond, before she could agree or refuse or ask a single one of the 1,000 questions detonating in her mind, he turned to the wolves gathered at the fence and spoke in a voice that was no longer quiet. "My name is Cullen Voss. I am Alpha King of the Northern Territories, and this woman is my mate. If anyone in this compound touches her again, I will not issue a challenge. I will not ask questions. I will simply kill you." He let the words settle like snow. "Am I understood?" 11 wolves nodded. Some of them did it twice. Halan turned back to Ren. His hand came up again, and this time his fingers cupped the side of her face, his thumb resting against her cheekbone, and she could feel the leather of his glove against her skin, and beneath that the heat of his palm, and beneath that the tremor in his hand, that told her the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, who had just torn through a chain-link fence like paper, was shaking. "I have been looking for you," he said quietly, as if the words were only for her, "for a very long time." Ren stood in the training pit with blood drying on her arm and a stranger's shirt around her shoulders, and the scent of pine resin in her lungs, and she did the only thing she could do. She told him the truth. "I do not know what is happening," she said. He almost smiled. The scar on his jaw shifted with the movement, and the almost smile was more devastating than a full one would have been, because it suggested that smiling was something he had forgotten how to do and was remembering in real time. "I will explain," he said, "but first we are going to leave this pit, and then I am going to find whoever decided that you should live like this, and I am going to have a conversation with them." The way he said conversation made it clear that the conversation would involve very few words and a great deal of damage. He offered her his arm, not his hand. His arm bent at the elbow the way she had read about in old books, the way wolves of high rank escorted their mates at formal functions. Ren looked at his arm, at the scars that mapped his skin like a history of violence, at the size of his forearm and the corded muscle beneath the surface, and she placed her hand on it. Her fingers were small and split-knuckled and dirty. His arm was warm. They walked out of the training pit together, through the gap he had torn in the fence. Behind them, Garrett remained in the dirt, and he did not look up. The stone lodge was a 40-year-old building made of river rock and cedar beams, originally built as a hunting cabin and expanded over the decades into something that wanted to be grand, but did not quite manage it. The main hall smelled of pine sap and spilled beer, and the faintly sweet rot of old taxidermy. A bear head mounted above the fireplace had lost one glass eye, and the empty socket stared at whoever sat in the Alpha's chair with the unsettling focus of something that could see more with one eye than most things could see with two. Alpha Kessler was sitting in that chair when Callan walked in with Ren on his arm. Kessler was a thick man in his 50s, with a grey-streaked beard, and the ruddy complexion of someone who drank more than he should, but less than he wanted to. He had been Alpha of Ashfall for 22 years, which was either a testament to his strength or a commentary on the weakness of his challengers. It was not cruel in the way Garrett was cruel, not theatrical about it. His cruelty was administrative. He simply did not see wolves like Ren. They existed below his threshold of attention, like furniture, like the one-eyed bear. He stood when Callan entered, because you stood when the Alpha King entered, and his face arranged itself into the expression of professional hospitality that he wore at all diplomatic functions. "Alpha King Callan," he said, "I was told you stepped out for air. I hope the grounds are to your—" And then he saw Ren, and the sentence died. "Where did you find her?" Kessler asked, and his voice had changed, flattened, the way voices flatten when their owners are calculating fast. "In your training pit," Callan said. He led Ren to one of the chairs near the fire and held it for her. She sat. The warmth of the fire hit her face, and she realized that she had been so cold for so long that she had stopped shivering, which was worse than shivering, which meant her body had given up on warming itself and was simply enduring. Cullen remained standing beside her chair. His hand rested on the back of it, not on her shoulder, not on her neck, just on the wood. But the placement said everything. This chair, this person, mine. "She is a low-ranking Omega," Kessler said, speaking carefully now, each word placed like a foot on uncertain ice. "She works in the medical bay and the kitchens. She has no official rank or family." He paused. "May I ask why she is wearing your shirt?" "Because her shirt was torn open by your beta's son," Callan said, who challenged her to a formal fight and then called her shoulder to the bone when she was clearly outmatched. "In your training pit, under your watch." Kessler's eyes moved to Ren, and for the first time in the 6 years she had lived in his compound, he actually looked at her. Not through her, at her. And what she saw in his face was not concern for her well-being, but concern for the situation. The rapid mental triage of a man who had just realized that something he had considered beneath his notice had become a diplomatic incident. "I will speak to Garrett," Kessler said. "You will do more than speak to him," Galen said. His voice was still quiet. He had not raised it once tonight. "She is my mate." The room, which had contained perhaps a dozen wolves from both delegations, went still. Kessler's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. His knuckles whitened. He looked at Wren again, and this time there was something new in his expression, something that Wren recognized because she had spent 6 years learning to read the faces of dangerous men. It was fear, not of her, of what she represented. An Omega from his pack, his lowest-ranking, most neglected member, wandered to the most powerful Alpha on the continent. Every bruise on her body, every missed meal, every torn shirt and unheated room was now evidence. Evidence of his failure, evidence of his negligence. "My congratulations," Kessler said. His voice was steady. His hand was not. "I would like a room," Kalen said, "for my mate, with a fire and clean bedding and hot water, and I would like your medic to attend to her wounds within the hour." "Of course." "And Kessler." Kalen turned to face the Ashfall Alpha directly, and for the first time Wren saw the full weight of his dominance, deployed not as violence but as gravity. "We will revisit the treaty terms in the morning. I suspect my priorities have changed." Kessler nodded. He did not ask how they had changed. He could feel it. The room they gave her was on the second floor of the lodge, a guest room with heavy curtains and a fireplace that someone had stacked with fresh birch logs. The blankets on the bed were thick and smelled like cedar shavings and the slightly stale sweetness of a room that had been closed up for weeks but aired out in a hurry. A basin of hot water sat on the nightstand, steam curling from the surface. Wren stood in the middle of the room and did not know what to do with her hands. Kalen had walked her upstairs himself, his hand on the small of her back, a touch so light it was almost imaginary, but present enough that she could feel the heat of his palm through 2 layers of fabric. He had stopped at the door. "I will send for the medic," he said, "and I will be in the room next to this one." He paused. "You are safe. I need you to know that. Whatever has been happening here is over." "You do not know me," Wren said. The words came out before she could stop them, raw and unpolished, and she winced at the sound of them because they were not graceful and not diplomatic and not what you were supposed to say to the Alpha King of the Northern Territories. Callan looked at her for a long moment. The fire from the hallway sconces caught the scar on his jaw and turned it silver. "No," he said, "I do not. But my wolf does, and he has never been wrong." He left. Wren sat on the bed and stared at the fire and pressed her hands to her chest, where the ember still burned, and tried to understand what had happened, and could not. The medic was not Howl. It was a woman from Callan's delegation, a calm-eyed wolf named Sable, who had hands that smelled like calendula oil and moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had stitched wounds in the field. She cleaned the claw marks on Wren's shoulder with a solution that stung like gasoline and then burned warm, and she wrapped them in clean bandages, and she did all of this without asking how the wounds had happened, which told Wren that she already knew. "The Alpha is not a patient man," Sable said, tying off the last bandage. She had a slight accent that Wren could not place, something that softened her consonants and lengthened her vowels. "But for you, he will try. He has never had a mate before." She looked at Wren. "He has been waiting." "How long?" Wren asked. Sable smiled. It was a small smile, private, the smile of someone who knew the answer but thought it was not her story to tell. "Long enough," she said, and gathered her supplies and left. Wren slept. She had not meant to. She had meant to sit up and think and plan and process the cascade of impossible things that had happened in the last 2 hours. But the bed was warm and the fire was steady, and her body, which had been running on adrenaline and the strange burning energy that had flooded her in the training pit, simply switched off. She woke to the sound of arguing. It was coming from the hallway, muffled by the heavy door, but not muffled enough to hide the tone. 2 voices, one she recognized as Kessler's, tight and controlled. The other was deeper, rougher, and she did not recognize it. But her wolf did. Her wolf surged toward the sound the way a plant turns toward sunlight. She opened the door. Callan and Kessler stood in the hallway. Callan was dressed again, a different shirt, dark gray, and his arms were crossed over his chest in a way that made his forearms look like they had been carved from the same stone as the lodge walls. Kessler was facing him, and between them, like a physical object hanging in the air, was a tension so thick that Wren could taste it on her tongue, metallic and sharp. "Tell me about her parents," Callan was saying. His voice was soft in the way that very dangerous things were soft, the way the surface of deep water was soft. Kessler exhaled. "Ilara Calloway was one of our border wolves, killed in the southern skirmish 6 years ago. Standard casualty. Her mate Ronan disappeared shortly after, presumed dead. Walked into the woods and did not come back." He spread his hands. "It happens. Grief is not kind to mated pairs." And after they were both gone, Callan said, "What happened to their daughter?" Kessler had the grace to hesitate. "She was placed in the general labor pool," he said. "Given duties suited to her rank. She is an Omega Alpha King, an unranked Omega with a weak wolf. There is no family to advocate for her. There is no," he searched for the word, "apparatus." "Apparatus," Callan repeated. He made the word sound like something he had found on the bottom of his shoe. "So when your beta son decided to use her as entertainment in the training pit, there was no apparatus." "Garrett is young," Kessler said. "He will be spoken to." Wren saw the moment Callan decided that the conversation was over. It was subtle, a shift in his weight, a settling the way a building settles before it stops settling and becomes still. "Kessler," he said, and the use of the name without the title was itself a statement. "Your beta's son challenged an unmated, unranked Omega to formal combat for sport. He outweighed her by 80 pounds. He drew blood. He kicked her in the ribs when she was down, and when I stepped in, every wolf at that fence was watching like they had seen it before." He paused. "That tells me something about your pack. Something I will remember when we discuss the mountain passes tomorrow." Kessler's face went through a complex negotiation between pride and pragmatism. "Pragmatism won," he nodded. "It will be addressed," he said. "It will be more than addressed," Callan said. "She comes with me. When I leave Ashfall, she leaves with me." He did not phrase it as a request. "We will discuss terms for her release from your pack in the morning." Kessler opened his mouth, and then he saw Wren standing in the doorway, and he closed it. He looked at her the way you look at a piece of furniture that has suddenly spoken, with the confused irritation of someone whose mental categories have been violated. Then he looked back at Callan. "Very well," he said. He walked away. His footsteps on the stone floor were heavy and deliberate, each one planted with the care of a man walking away from an explosion without flinching. Callan turned to Wren. "You heard," he said. "Not a question." "Yes." "And?" Wren leaned against the doorframe. The bandage on her shoulder pulled with the movement, a tugging pain that reminded her that the night had not been a dream. "You are asking if I want to leave with you," she said. "I am telling you that you are leaving with me," he said. And then his expression changed, just slightly, a softening at the corners of his mouth that was not a smile, but the promise of one. "But I am also asking." She looked at him. at the scar on his jaw, and the amber eyes, and the way he stood in the hallway of a lodge that was not his, in a territory that was not his, with a shirt that was not the one she had worn for 2 hours before falling asleep, but she could still feel the ghost of his warmth in it. She thought about the room she had been living in, a converted storage closet off the medical bay with a mattress on the floor and no window. She thought about Garrett's boot connecting with her shin. She thought about 6 years of meals eaten standing up in the kitchen, because there was no seat for her at any table. "I do not know you," she said again, because it was true and because truth was the only currency she had. His almost smile came back. The scar shifted. "I know," he said. He stepped closer, not into her space but to the edge of it, and his scent found her again, and her wolf pressed against the inside of her ribs like a cat pressing against a closed door. "But I would like you to know me." There was a vulnerability in the way he said it that did not match the rest of him. That did not match the fence-tearing and the threat-making and the Alpha King gravity that bent the behavior of everyone around him. It was a vulnerability that lived in the pause between would like and you two, a half-second gap where something real showed through the armor. "Okay," Ren said. They left Ashfall at dawn. The Alpha King's convoy was 4 vehicles, black, unremarkable, the kind of vehicles that were designed to not attract attention and in doing so attracted a different kind of attention entirely. Ren sat in the back of the lead vehicle beside Kallen, with Sable driving and a wolf named Marcus in the passenger seat. Marcus was Kylan's second, a lean man with a shaved head and pale blue eyes who looked at Ren with an expression of careful neutrality that she suspected was his version of warm welcome. She watched Ashfall shrink in the rearview mirror. The stone lodge, the training compound, the fence that Kallen had torn open, which no one had repaired. She waited to feel something, loss maybe, nostalgia, fear. What she felt instead was the absence of weight, the physical lightness that comes from setting something heavy down after carrying it so long that you had forgotten it was there. The drive to the Northern Territories took 9 hours. Ren learned things. She learned that Cullen was 31 and had been Alpha King since he was 22, which meant he had taken the title by challenge from his own father, a fact he mentioned without emotion the way someone might mention changing a tire. "My father was not a good king," he said. He was looking out the window at the passing trees when he said it, and the trees were tall pines, the kind that grew in the mountain passes, their trunks dark and straight like columns holding up a green ceiling. He was strong, but strength without purpose is just violence with better PR. She learned that his wolf was a problem. Kallen said this directly without self-pity, the way a mechanic might describe a difficult engine. It was too large, too aggressive, too close to the surface. There were days when the shift came without being called, when he woke up with claws out and furniture broken and no memory of the transition. His pack had learned to give him space on those days. They left food outside his door and did not knock. "It is better now," he said, and he looked at her when he said it, and she understood that now meant since the training pit. She learned that his scar was from a border war when he was 24. A rival Alpha's claws across his face during a fight that had lasted 40 minutes and ended with the rival Alpha dead and Kallen standing in a field with his face open to the bone and his wolf, refusing to let anyone near him to stitch it. "Sable stitched it," he said. She was the only one he would let close. He paused. Until now, and Ren learned that Calloway was not a name that was unknown in the Northern Territories. It was Marcus who told her, during a rest stop at a gas station that smelled like a diesel fuel and burnt coffee. Kallen had gone inside for water, and Marcus leaned against the vehicle and looked at Ren with those pale blue eyes and said, "Calloway. Your mother was Alara Calloway." "Yes," Ren said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Alara Calloway was born in the Northern Territories." "Did you know that?" Wren did not know that. She left when she was 19, Marcus said, before Kylan's time. Before mine, but the records are there. Alara Voss. She changed her name to Calloway when she mated your father and moved to Ashfall. Wren felt the ground shift under her feet, not physically. The gas station pavement was cracked and solid, and she could feel every pebble through the thin soles of her boots. But something inside her rearranged itself, a piece of a puzzle she had not known she was assembling clicking into place. Voss, she said, the same as Kylan's family name. Marcus nodded. He had the expression of a man who had delivered news he was not sure he was authorized to deliver, and was deciding in real time whether to regret it. She was a cousin, he said, distant. But the bloodline is the bloodline. Wren stood in a gas station parking lot in the mountains, and felt the ember in her chest pulse. Her mother had been northern. Her mother had been a Voss, her wolf, her runt wolf that had never been strong, that had never shifted properly, that had been laughed at by every wolf in Ashfall, was not weak because it was defective. It was dormant, suppressed, maybe, waiting. Does Kylan know? She asked. Marcus looked toward the gas station door. He knows, he said. Kylan came back with water and a protein bar that he handed to Wren without being asked, as if feeding her was already automatic, already instinct. She took it and ate it in the car, and the bar was dry and tasted like chocolate-flavored cardboard, but it was the first food she had been given rather than scavenged in longer than she could remember, and she chewed it slowly because her stomach had been empty long enough that eating too fast would make her sick. They drove on. The trees thickened, the road narrowed, and somewhere in the third hour, when the sun was fully up and burning through the fog, Kylan reached across the space between their seats and placed his hand, palm up on the leather. He did not say anything. He did not look at her. He simply offered his hand, open, waiting, the way you put out food for a feral cat, not grabbing, not demanding, just making the offering available. Wren looked at his hand. The palm was calloused, the fingers long, the knuckles scarred. It was a hand that had built things and broken things, and was now being held very still so as not to frighten her. She put her hand in his fingers closed around hers. Gentle, the warmth of his skin against her cold fingers was immediate and total, and her wolf made that sound again, the sound that was like coming home, and she heard, very faintly, a low rumble from his chest, a purr. She did not know Alpha Kings purred. She did not think he knew either, because his jaw tightened and a flush crept up his neck that he clearly wished was not there. They held hands for the remaining 6 hours of the drive. Neither of them spoke about it. The Northern Territory's compound was not a compound. It was a small city, built into the side of a mountain, with stone buildings that looked like they had grown from the rock rather than being constructed on it. The central hall was 3 stories tall with windows that faced the valley and let in the light of the setting sun, which painted everything in shades of copper and gold. It smelled like pine and wood smoke and something else. Something that Wren would come to recognize as the collective scent of 600 wolves living in proximity. A layered, complex musk that was not unpleasant, but was overwhelming in its density. Kylan walked her through the main entrance with his hand still on her back. Wolf stopped, stared, whispered. She could hear the whispers because her hearing had been sharper since the training pit, sharper than it should have been for an omega with a runt wolf, and the whispers were confused and curious and not hostile, but not warm either. That is her? She is so small. An Ashfall wolf. Is that blood on her shirt? Kylan ignored the whispers the way mountains ignored weather. He took her to a room on the 3rd floor of the central hall. A room that was large and warm and had a bed that was an actual bed, not a mattress on a floor with blankets that were thick and clean and smelled like lavender. There was a bathroom with a tub that was large enough to lie down in. There was a closet with clothes that were clearly new, tags still on, in sizes that were close to hers but not exact, as if someone had estimated. "Sable will bring you whatever you need," Kalen said. He was standing in the doorway again, one hand on the frame, and she was starting to understand that he did this deliberately, that he stayed at the threshold, that he did not enter her space without invitation. "My room is at the end of the hall." He turned to leave. "Kalan," she said. It was the first time she had used his name, and the sound of it in her own voice surprised her, the way it moved through her mouth, the way his shoulders went still when he heard it. He stopped, turned halfway. The setting sun from the hallway window caught his face and turned the amber of his eyes to molten gold. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and then something in his expression broke. Just a crack, just enough to let through a sliver of something raw and enormous that had been pressing against the surface since the training pit. "Do not thank me," he said. "Not for this." He paused. "You should never have to thank someone for treating you like you matter." He left. Ren sat on the bed and buried her face in the lavender-scented blankets and cried for the first time in 3 years. Not because she was sad, but because she had forgotten what it felt like to be warm, and the remembering was its own kind of pain. The days that followed were strange and gentle and punctuated by moments that made her wolves sing. Kalen gave her space. He did not touch her unless she initiated it. He did not ask questions about Ashfall unless she offered. But he was there, always nearby, always findable, a gravitational constant in her orbit. She would walk into the dining hall and he would be at a table, and there would be a seat next to him, and the seat would be empty even in a room full of wolves who wanted to sit next to the Alpha King, because everyone understood that the seat was hers. He brought her books. This surprised her more than anything. Not romance novels, not wolf history, but a thick paperback about mycology, the study of fungi, because she had mentioned once, in the car, in passing, that her mother used to take her mushroom hunting and she missed it. He brought the book and left it on her nightstand without comment, and she found it when she came back from the medical bay, where she had been helping Sable reorganize the supply closet, and she held it against her chest and pressed her forehead to the cover and breathed in the smell of new paper. She started working in the medical bay because doing nothing made her feel like a guest, and she did not want to be a guest. Sable did not object. The other medics did not object. They watched Ren identify medicinal herbs by scent alone and stitch a wound with small, neat sutures that closed cleaner than anyone else's, and their watching shifted from suspicious to curious, to something approaching respect. A wolf was changing. She felt it first in her dreams. The wolf in her mind, the one that had always been small and cringing and pressed against the back wall of her consciousness, was growing. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily, the way a plant grows when you move it from shadow to sunlight. It stood taller. Its fur, which had been a dull brown, was developing streaks of silver. Its eyes were gold. She felt it in her waking body too. She was faster than before, stronger. The claw marks on her shoulder healed in 4 days instead of the 2 weeks that normal Omega healing would have required. Her senses sharpened until she could stand in the central hall and identify individual wolves by their scent from 3 rooms away. Sable noticed. Of course Sable noticed. The medic was watching Ren's vitals during a routine checkup when she stopped, looked at the numbers, looked at Ren and said, "Your resting heart rate is 52. Last week it was 68. She paused. "That is not an Omega's heart rate. That is a warrior's." Ren did not know what to say. Sable said, "Has anyone ever tested your bloodline?" "No," Ren said. No one had ever cared enough to test. Sable made a note. She did not tell Ren what the note said. But that evening, Sable walked into Kalen's study with a folder, and the study door closed, and it stayed closed for an hour. Wren tried not to think about it. She went to the compound's small library instead, a room on the ground floor that smelled like old paper and furniture polish. And she sat in the corner chair and opened her mycology book and tried to read about the reproductive cycle of morels. She could not concentrate. The ember in her chest was restless. The door opened. Kailan came in. He smelled like his study, leather and ink, and underneath that his own scent, the pine and cedar and lightning that had become the most familiar smell in her world. He sat down across from her, in a chair that was slightly too small for him, and the sight of his large frame in the dainty library chair would have been funny if his expression had not been so serious. "Your mother," he said, "was a Voss." Wren closed the book. "Yes," she said. "Marcus told me." Callan nodded. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, and the gesture made him look less like a king and more like a man with difficult news. She was not just a cousin. She was the daughter of Alaric Voss. "My father's brother." Wren stared at him. "That makes us," Callan said. And he paused, and in the pause she could see him choosing his next words with the care of someone diffusing a bomb. "Cousins by blood. Distant enough that it does not affect the mate bond. The bond would not form if it did, but close enough that your wolf is not Omega. It never was." The room was very quiet. Wren could hear the clock on the wall, an old analog clock with a brass pendulum, ticking with the patience of something that had been keeping time long before she was born, and would keep time long after. "What am I?" she asked. Callan looked at her. His amber eyes were steady. "You are a Voss," he said. "Your wolf is alpha line. It has been suppressed probably since childhood. Your mother may have done it deliberately to protect you. Alaric had enemies. The easiest way to hide an alpha-line wolf is to make it look like an omega." Wren felt the ember in her chest ignite, not metaphorically. Not the slow burn she had been feeling for days. An ignition, a sudden roaring heat that spread from her sternum outward in all directions, and her wolf surged forward and her vision went gold. And she gasped and gripped the arms of the chair and the wood cracked under her fingers. Callan was on his feet instantly. He knelt in front of her, his hands hovering but not touching, his eyes blazing amber, his wolf pressing forward in response to hers. "Wren," he said, "Reeve. Look at me. Breathe." She looked at him. His face was inches from hers. She could see the texture of his skin, the fine stubble along his jaw, the way his scar was slightly raised, a ridge of pale tissue that she wanted, suddenly and fiercely, to trace with her fingertip. She breathed. The heat did not recede, but it steadied, becoming less wildfire and more hearthfire, controlled and warm. "There you are," he murmured. His eyes were on hers, and his wolf was in his voice, a low bass note that vibrated through her bones. "There you are." She reached up and touched the scar on his jaw, her fingertip against the raised line of tissue. His eyes closed. His breath stopped, and then, slowly, like a building exhaling, the tension in his body released, and he leaned into her touch, and his wolf made a sound that she felt more than heard, a deep, resonant hum that settled into her chest and wrapped around the fire and held it. "I want to know you," she said. The words came from somewhere below thought, from the place where her wolf lived, from the ember that was now a flame. "I want to know all of it." His eyes opened. The gold in them was so bright it was almost white. "You will," he said. He turned his face into her palm and pressed his lips to the center of it. A kiss that was not a kiss but a seal, a marker, a promise written on her skin in warmth. "You will." The next 3 weeks were education in being alive. Wren trained with the Northern Territories warriors, and every session peeled back another layer of suppression from her wolf. Callan did not train her himself. He said he could not be objective, which she suspected was code for, "I will maul anyone who touches you," and that is counterproductive to sparring. Instead, she trained with Marcus, whose fighting style was surgical and precise and who treated her with the crisp professionalism of someone who had decided to withhold judgment until the evidence was in. The evidence came in fast. By the end of the first week, Ren was matching wolves twice her size. By the end of the second, she was beating them. Her wolf was not a runt. It had never been a runt. It had been compressed, folded in on itself, a fist that had been clenched so long the fingers had forgotten they could open. Now it was opening. She shifted fully for the first time on a Tuesday morning in late November in the clearing behind the central hall, with frost on the grass and her breath smoking in the cold air. Marcus was there. Sable was there. Kaelin was not there because she had asked him not to be, not because she did not want him to see, but because she needed to do this alone, needed to know that this was hers and not a performance. The shift hurt, not the way she expected, not the breaking and remaking that other wolves described, but more like a skin being shed, a tight thing peeling away to reveal something larger underneath. Her bones realigned. Her muscles remapped, her vision fractured into prismatic color, and then clarified into a sharpness that made the human world look like a painting seen through water. When it was done, she was standing in the clearing on 4 legs, and Marcus was staring at her, and Sable was staring at her, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Her wolf was silver, not gray, not white, not the dusky mixed coat of a normal wolf. Silver, the bright living silver of liquid metal, of moonlight on still water, of something that did not belong in the natural world, and was there anyway. She was not large by alpha standards, not the towering beast that Kalan's wolf was, but she was not small either. She was built for speed and precision, lean and angular, and her eyes in wolf form were not gold, but platinum, a pale fire that burned without heat. Marcus said one word, Silverline. Sable said, "I need to call the Alpha." Ren shifted back. The shift was easier in reverse, a settling, a return. She stood naked and shaking in the frost-bitten clearing with her silver hair, which had been brown an hour ago, falling over her shoulders, and she laughed. Not a pretty laugh. A raw, cracked, shocked laugh that came from the same place the fire lived and carried with it 6 years of being told she was nothing. Marcus gave her his jacket. It smelled like clean cotton and gun oil. She pulled it on and it fell to her knees, and she was still laughing when Kaelin came running out of the central hall. Because Sable had apparently done more than call, she had screamed across the mind link that every wolf in the compound shared, and the Alpha King arrived at the clearing at a dead sprint with his shirt untucked and his eyes wild. He stopped at the edge of the clearing. He looked at her. Silver-haired, wrapped in Marcus's jacket, barefoot in the frost, laughing. His face did something she had never seen it do. It crumbled. Not in grief, not in pain, in the way that a wall crumbles when you remove the last brick, when the thing that has been holding itself together stops trying and lets whatever is behind it come through. And what came through was raw, unfiltered, devastating tenderness. The Alpha King of the Northern Territories stood at the edge of a frosty clearing and looked at his mate with an expression that would have brought empires to their knees. Ren stopped laughing. They looked at each other across 30 feet of frozen grass, and between them the mate bond hummed like a plucked string, and Ren's wolf pressed against her ribs, and Callan's wolf pressed back, and the clearing was very quiet, except for the sound of 2 hearts beating in the same rhythm. Kaelin walked toward her, slowly, as if she might disappear. He reached her and his hands came up and cupped her face, both hands warm and rough and shaking, and his thumbs traced the line of her cheekbones, and he said, "Silver." She nodded. He kissed her forehead, not her mouth, her forehead, his lips warm against the skin above her brow, and then he pulled her against his chest and wrapped his arms around her and held her, and she could feel his heart beat against her cheek, fast and strong and present, and his scent closed around her like a room she had been trying to find her whole life. "I knew," he said, into her hair, against her scalp, his breath warm on her skin. "I knew you were not what they said you were." She pressed closer. His arms tightened, and standing in a frozen clearing at the edge of the world, wrapped in a borrowed jacket that smelled like gun oil, Wren Calloway, who had been the lowest-ranking wolf in Ashfall, began to understand what it meant to be found. The weeks turned. The fire grew, and then Garrett came. He came in the dead of night, not to the northern territories, but to the edge of them, to the southern border, where the territory met the unclaimed wildlands. And he did not come alone. He brought 20 wolves, Ashfall fighters, young and angry and following the Beta's son because Garrett had told them that the Alpha King had stolen an Ashfall wolf by force, and that this was an act of war. It was not true, of course, but truth was not Garrett's currency. Performance was. Wren learned about it from Marcus, who came to the medical bay where she was cataloguing herbs, with her jaw tight and his pale eyes sharp. "We have a situation," he said. 20 Ashfall wolves at the southern border. The Beta's son is leading them. He is claiming right of recovery. Right of recovery was an old law, older than most wolves remembered, that allowed a pact to reclaim a member who had been taken against their will. It required the claimant to prove the taking was involuntary. It also required a trial by combat if the proof was disputed. "But I was not taken," Wren said. "I left willingly." Cullen asked, and I agreed. Kessler approved the release. Marcus nodded. "That is what we told them. Garrett says you were coerced, that the Alpha King used dominance to override your consent." He paused. "He is also claiming something else." "What?" "That you are carrying property of the Ashfall Pack. Specifically, that your wolf, now that it has been revealed as Silverline, is a strategic asset that belongs to Ashfall by right of birth, since you were born in their territory." Wren felt the cold settle into her like water into stone. "That is not how bloodline law works," she said. "No," Marcus agreed. "It is not, but Garrett is counting on the fight, not the law. If Cullen refuses combat, it looks like he is hiding behind technicalities. If he accepts, Garrett has 20 wolves to his 1. Wren said, "Where is Kylan?" Marcus looked at her, and for the first time his expression was not neutral. It was concerned. "He is at the southern border," he said. "He left 20 minutes ago." Wren was running before Marcus finished the sentence. The southern border was a 40-minute drive and a 15-minute run in wolf form. Wren made it in 12. Her silver wolf tore through the pine forest, paws barely touching the frozen ground, and the trees blurred past her in streaks of dark green, and the cold air burned her lungs, and she did not care because the mate bond was pulling her forward like a rope attached to her ribs, and every second she was not at his side felt like a second spent drowning. She heard them before she saw them. Voices. Garrett's, loud and performing, always performing. Kalen's, low and controlled, the voice of a man who was choosing his words with the precision of someone placing explosives. She burst through the tree line and into the border clearing. Kalen stood on the northern side of the border, alone. His wolf was close to the surface. She could see it in the amber glow of his eyes, and the way his muscles were coiled beneath his shirt, and the way the air around him seemed to vibrate with barely contained force. He had not shifted. He was holding himself in human form by will, and the effort of it showed in the tendons of his neck and the set of his jaw. On the Ashfall side, Garrett stood with his 20 wolves arranged behind him in a loose formation. He was wearing combat gear, black tactical clothing that looked new and fit poorly across his soft shoulders. His filed canines were out. He was grinning. But his eyes were not grinning. Wren saw it immediately, the way she had learned to read eyes in 6 years of survival. Garrett's eyes were doing the rapid darting calculation of a man who was in over his head and knew it, and was hoping the performance would carry him through. Wren shifted. The transition was smooth now, human form reassembling around her like water finding its level, and she stood at the tree line in the clothes she had been wearing, sweating and breathing hard, and every wolf in both parties turned to look at her. Garrett's face went through a complicated spasm. She had changed since Ashfall. The gaunt edges were gone, filled in by 3 weeks of regular meals. Her hair was silver now, not brown, and it caught the moonlight in a way that made the clearing brighter. Her eyes were gold. She stood straight, not hunched, not small, and the wolf behind her eyes was not hiding. "Wren," Garrett said, and his voice cracked on the word. Just slightly, just enough to show the fracture. "Come home." She stared at him. Of all the things she had expected him to say, that was not among them. Come home. As if Ashfall had ever been a home. As if the converted storage closet and the kicks to the ribs and the formal challenges designed to humiliate her constituted a home. But then she saw something else in his face, something that made her pause. Garrett was afraid, not of Callan, not of the fight. He was afraid of her, of what she had become, and underneath the fear, buried so deep that she almost missed it, was something that looked like regret. Not the grand, performative regret of a man who wants to be forgiven. The small, private regret of a man who has realized too late that the thing he dismissed was the thing that mattered. It lasted only a moment. Then his face hardened and the performance returned and the regret disappeared behind filed canines and tactical gear. "I invoke right of recovery," Garrett said, louder now, for the audience. "This wolf was taken from Ashfall territory under duress. I demand trial by combat for her return." Callan's voice came from behind her, and it was not the voice of a man. It was the voice of something larger and older and infinitely more dangerous. "Denied," he said. "She left willingly. Your own Alpha approved the release. This right of recovery claim is fraudulent and you know it." "Then prove it," Garrett said. "Fight me." Wren felt the bond pulse. She felt Kaelin's wolf surge, felt the rage that poured through the connection like boiling water through a pipe. And she knew with the absolute certainty that the mate bond provided, that if Callan shifted right now he would not stop at winning the fight. He would kill Garrett. He would kill all 20 wolves behind Garrett. And then he would stand in a field of bodies, and his wolf would howl, and the political consequences would ripple outward like a stone dropped into a lake that was already too full. She stepped forward. "I will fight you," she said. The clearing went silent. Kaelin's hand closed on her arm, not hard, not grabbing, but present. "Wren," he said. She turned to look at him. His face was a war, terror and pride, and the desperate need to protect her fighting against the knowledge that she was not the Omega he had found in the pit. She was Silverline. She was a Voss. "Let me," she said, quietly. "For him alone. I need to do this." His hand trembled on her arm. His wolf raged behind his eyes. But he looked at her, really looked at her, and he saw what she was asking and what it meant. And after a long moment that felt like a year, his hand released her arm and his fingers slid down to her wrist and then to her hand, and he squeezed once, hard, and let go. "If he hurts you," Kaelin said, and his voice broke, actually broke, the Alpha King's voice cracking like ice over a river. "I will end this. All of it." She touched his jaw, traced the scar. He closed his eyes and leaned into her hand, and she felt the tremor run through his entire body. Then she turned and walked to the center of the clearing. Garrett looked at her, and for 1 second, one flickering second, His expression was the face of a boy who had just realized that the game he was playing had real rules and real consequences and real teeth. Then it was gone. Formal challenge, he said. Half shift, first to yield or go unconscious. Ren said, full shift. Garrett blinked. The wolves behind him shifted their weight. Full shift was dangerous. Full shift in a border clearing was how wolves died. But Ren was not the wolf who had been in the training pit 3 weeks ago, and she knew it, and she needed Garrett to know it too. Full shift, Garrett agreed, because refusing would have been the end of his performance, and the performance was all he had. They shifted. Garrett's wolf was brown and heavy, thick-shouldered, powerful in the way of wolves bred for force rather than finesse. He snapped his jaws, a sound like a trap closing, and his eyes were flat and grey. Ren's wolf was silver. She heard the gasps from the ashful wolves. 20 of them, men and women who had watched her train for years, who had laughed at her runt wolf, who had looked through her the way Kessler looked through her, were now staring at a silver wolf that stood in the moonlight like something from the old stories. The stories their grandparents told about the wolves who came before, the wolves who ran with lightning in their veins. Garrett attacked. He was fast. She gave him that. He came in low and hard, teeth aimed for her throat, the kill shot of a wolf who had decided that this would end quickly because the alternative was thinking about what he was fighting, and that thinking would destroy him. Ren moved. She did not dodge. She did not redirect, she flowed. Her body shifted like water around his attack, and as he passed she struck. Her jaws closed on his hind leg, not deep, not damaging, but enough to flip his momentum, and he tumbled, and before he could recover, she was on him. The paws on his shoulders, her weight pressing him into the frozen earth. Her teeth at his throat. She could feel his pulse under her canines. Rapid, terrified. She held. The clearing was silent except for the sound of Garrett's wolf panting in quick, panicked bursts, and the distant sound of the wind in the pines and the beating of 22 hearts. Ren opened her jaws. She stepped back. She shifted to human form and stood over the wolf who had kicked her when she was down, who had filed his canines to look dangerous, who had challenged her for sport, and she said 2 words. Get up. Garrett shifted. He lay on the frozen ground in human form, breathing hard, his tactical clothing torn, his face dirty, and his eyes were wide and lost and very young. It is over, Ren said. Go home, Garrett. There is nothing for you here. He looked at her. And in his face, just for a moment, she saw it again. The regret, the small, private, too-late understanding. He opened his mouth, and she thought he was going to say something real, something that did not belong to the performance. But then his jaw tightened, and he closed his mouth and nodded. He got up. He walked back to his wolves. They turned together and walked into the trees, and the sound of their footsteps on the frozen ground faded into the sound of the wind and then into silence. Ren stood in the clearing, and the cold bit at her bare feet and the adrenaline drained from her muscles, and she felt, very suddenly, like a person standing on the edge of a very tall building, not falling, not jumping, just standing there and feeling the height. Then Kailan was there. His arms around her, his face in her hair, his wolf making a sound that was not a growl and not a purr, but a prayer, a sound that wolves made when they had almost lost the thing they could not lose and had not. She pressed her face into his chest and breathed. They walked back to the Northern Territories together, his coat around her shoulders, a hand in his. The pine tree standing sentinel on either side of the path, tall and dark and patient. The marking ceremony happened 3 days later. It was not the grand political affair that marking ceremonies typically were for Alpha Kings. Callan had wanted something simple. Ren had wanted something true. They compromised on a gathering in the central hall, the same hall with the copper light windows, with the pack wolves in attendance, but no outside delegations, no diplomats, no performance. Wren wore a dress that Sable had found for her, pale blue, simple, the fabric soft against her skin. She wore her boots, the steel-toed ones that Hal the medic had given her back in Ashfall, because they were the one thing from her old life that had been given with kindness, and she wanted that kindness present. The hall smelled like pine and beeswax candles, and the 600 wolves who stood in concentric circles around the center where Callan waited. He was wearing black, no insignia, no crown, no ornamentation except the scar on his jaw, and the amber eyes that tracked her movement across the hall with the intensity of a man watching the sun rise for the first time. Marcus stood to his left, Sable stood to his right. Both of them were smiling, and Marcus's smile was the most startling thing Wren had seen in the Northern Territories, because it transformed his sharp face into something almost gentle. Wren warped to the center. Callan took her hands. His fingers wrapped around hers, warm and steady, and the trembling was gone. Whatever uncertainty had lived in him during those first days, whatever fear had made the Alpha King's hands shake, it had been replaced by something solid and certain, the bedrock stillness of a man who had found what he was looking for and did not intend to let it go. The words of the ceremony were old. Wren barely heard them. She was listening instead to the bond, which was singing a high, clear note that lived in her chest, and in his chest, and in the space between them, a sound that only they could hear. When the ceremony reached its final moment, Callan leaned down. His lips brushed her ear. His breath was warm and smelled like the mint tea he had been drinking all morning. "This is going to hurt," he murmured. "I'm sorry." She turned her head and kissed his jaw, the scar, the ridge of pale tissue that she had traced with her fingertip in a library that smelled like old paper. "I know," she said. He marked her. His canine sank into the junction of her neck and shoulder, through skin and into muscle, and the pain was a bright, singing thing that raced through her body like electricity. And then it was not pain but something else, something that the language she knew did not have a word for, a merging, a completion, the two separate notes of the bond becoming one chord. She felt his wolf, not around her, inside her, a vast, dark, powerful presence that settled into the spaces her own wolf did not fill, and she felt her wolf do the same in him, the silver thread weaving through the dark, and together they made something that was neither silver nor dark but both, a new thing, a whole thing. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet. The Alpha King of the Northern Territories had tears on his face, and he did not hide them, did not wipe them away, did not look away from her. He let them fall, and he let his pack see them, and the pack was silent in the way that witnesses are silent at things they know they will remember. Wren touched his face. His tears were warm under her fingers. "I know you now," she said. He turned his face into her palm and breathed, and his breath hitched. And then he smiled, a real smile, the first real smile she had seen on his face, a full, unguarded, devastating smile that used every muscle and crinkled the skin around his eyes and shifted the scar, and was, in that moment, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The pack cheered, 600 wolves raising their voices in a sound that was not quite human and not quite animal, but something between. Something that shook the copper-lit windows and rattled the beeswax candles and carried across the mountain and into the valley and up into the cold night air where the stars, indifferent and ancient, held their places in the dark. Wren stood in the center of it all with the Alpha King's mark on her neck and his hand in hers and the taste of his tears on her fingertips. The mate bond hummed in her chest, steady and warm, a fire that had been an ember and was now a hearth. 600 wolves sang around her, and she let the sound wash over her like a warm tide, and she smelled pine resin and cedar smoke and the ozone-bright scent of lightning, and she stood there in her good boots, in her simple dress with silver hair and gold eyes and a wolf that had finally remembered what it was. And she was warm. In the weeks that followed, the compound learned to know its new Luna. Wren kept working in the medical bay. She kept her boots. She kept the mycology book on her nightstand, open to the chapter on morels, a bookmark made from a torn piece of the curtain she had once used to patch her pants in Ashfall. Some mornings she woke before dawn and went to the clearing behind the central hall and shifted and ran, her silver wolf cutting through the fog, and Callan's dark wolf ran beside her, enormous and silent, his stride matched to hers. They did not run toward anything. They just ran, and on those mornings when the first light hit the mountain and turned the frost to diamonds and the pine trees stood like dark columns against the brightening sky, Wren could feel her mother's hands in memory, holding dried leaves under her nose in a kitchen with a tin roof, and the smell of yarrow and comfrey and mugwort mixed with pine and cedar and lightning, and the 2 scents became 1 scent. And the past and the present became one thing, and the ember in her chest, which had been burning since the night a king tore through a fence for her, was steady and sure, and did not need to be anything more than what it was. A flame, tended, home.